I knocked on the door with the kind of hope that makes your knuckles smart. And when it opened, she looked at me as if I were a stranger standing in the wrong century. Do you know that feeling when the house you raised a child in turns its rooms into someone else's museum? That's how the foyer smelled, polished wood and expensive candles, the sort of clean that rubs out fingerprints and memories both. I had driven 600 miles with a mason jar of quarters in the passenger seat, a chipped mug tucked under my arm like contraband, and a heart full of Sunday dinners and lullabies. I had not imagined that the first face to greet me would be a woman I loved so deeply, and yet who could look at me with such precise, practiced indifference. Was I naive? Perhaps. Did I expect to be swept into the center of the celebration, handed a piece of cake and a christening ribbon? Of course, mothers still dream of these small, ridiculous things. But when my daughter, my Lily, met my eyes and smiled thinly, then turned to the man behind her in a navy blazer and said, "Call security," I could feel something inside me break in a way that was less loud than it was final. My hands shook so badly that the chipped mug hit the floor and cracked like a lie being exposed. The hostess, with pearls that cost more than my savings, watched with the polite curiosity of someone watching a kite snap from its string. For a second, I thought she would say my name, pull me inside with that maternal magnetism that once guided me through midnight fevers and scraped knees. Instead, she touched Lily's arm and said, "We didn't expect," as if I were a weather event interrupting their carefully scheduled sunshine. "I suppose I should tell you, before I let you see the whole dark tapestry, about the ordinary life I had before this day, about the mason jar, the pearls and the letters tucked into a small locked box beneath the bed. You must understand where I came from to understand how the coldness tasted. Otherwise the betrayal will hang in the air like a word without a mouth. I have always loved small things. A mason jar of coins on my kitchen shelf was my most faithful monument. People write of castles and inheritances. I tended to a tomato plant in a cracked pot and counted my savings in coins. The jar was not for show. It was for loneliness and for the trips I promised myself after the funeral. For the bus tickets I would someday use to visit Lily, who had fled to the city and then, to put it plainly, flourished. My pearls were older than Lily. They had belonged to my mother and had been restrained for years in a velvet pouch. I wore them on Sundays to Mass, sometimes to bed on nights I was scared, and once I let Lily play with them in the kitchen when she was small, watching them roll like little moons across the counter. My life before the house was warm and small, a bungalow on Maple Street appraised for about $230,000, a garden, an old radio, a stack of letters tied with a thread of blue I could never find again. I paid my bills with care and never missed a payment. I baked bread and mended shirts. I was proud of the old chipped mug. My hands had wrapped it like a child in winter, and it tasted of chamomile tea and years of mornings. I taught Lily to tie her shoes and to speak truth as delicately as possible. I told her once that honesty was a currency no thief could counterfeit. Perhaps that is why the sight of the banquet hall, the crystal chandeliers, and the guest list pinned at the door felt like a betrayal writ large. When Lily left home at 22 with a suitcase of ambition, I did not expect diamonds. I expected the occasional phone call and the photographs sent with captions like, "We're so blessed." What I did not expect was that my daughter would, in the space of a decade, become a steward of such curated lives that she would need to tidy away the past. The early days of her success were thrilling. I remember the lunch on August 14th when she called to say she had accepted a position managing a boutique law firm downtown. We celebrated over the cracked kitchen table with soda and store-bought cupcakes. She promised to visit. She promised to send money for the roof. For a time she did. Then the calls grew sparse, then the messages had fewer words, and the photographs came with backgrounds that were all marble and orchids. I could have been bitter then, and perhaps I was quietly like old embers in the hearth, but I chose to be proud. I polished my pearls and smiled when she arrived, even when she seemed a little startled at the narrowness of my kitchen. "Mother," she would say, smoothing her blouse as if the house might wrinkle it. "How brave you are." I took brave to mean lonely but steady. I could live with bravery. I could not have lived with the memory of being spoken about as one would speak of a stray cat. You must know this. Family is a house of many doors, some open and some hidden behind false fronts. On a calendar I keep by the stove, I have written the date April 3rd in my careful looping script. That date is 2 days before the gala Lily would later host in the mansion she now calls home. April 3rd is important because it was the last time I saw a letter from her that did not smell faintly of perfume and caution. The letter said, "We can't manage the pressure of family obligations right now. Please understand." There was no signature, only a name typed in a way that felt official and detached. I folded that letter and put it in the locked box with the other things. An old photograph of Lily at 5, a ticket stub from the first movie we saw together, and a small, brittle receipt with the figure $230,000 scrawled in a banker's hand. An appraisal for the bungalow, dated February 12th. I tell you these things not to evoke pity. I tell them because the everyday objects are the anchors for what comes after. The mason jar, the pearls, the chipped mug. These are the maps by which a woman like me navigates treachery. If a thief steals a coin, you might call it small loss. If she steals the map, you are lost entirely. When I arrived at Lily's shower on that bright Saturday, I thought the surprise would make us laugh. I thought she would see me at the height of her display and remember the damp nights we had spent folding blankets in the winter. I thought of the baby, the smallness she carried beneath her hand, my granddaughter, whose name I had imagined while whispering over a newspaper crossword on a slow Tuesday in January. I had rehearsed a phrase to say when I saw the bump, a gateway phrase meant to bridge the years. I did not get that far. Instead, a woman in a navy blazer, who turned out to be Lily's fiancé's cousin, asked for my invitation. I gave her a smile like a stone. "Do you have an invitation?" she asked. For a moment, I thought it was a ritual, a game where one might produce a card from a purse and be admitted back into a scene one had never left. I remembered the little card I had saved from Lily's wedding. No, from her college graduation party. No, the last time she had invited me to anything important. The card would have mattered less than the look in her eyes. "What a surprise," the cousin said, and that phrase was the last bridge. "You invited my mother," I heard someone mutter. It was a voice that sounded like polished silver. I turned and saw faces like mirrors, reflecting a woman who seemed to have been carefully constructed for the public world. A woman asked me my name like one reads the weather report. When I said Evelyn, she offered a faint nod and then, as if fulfilling a script, placed a phone call. The man on the other end wore the uniform of the mansion, security, courtesy, a badge like an exclamation point. I do not like to cause a scene. Yet the mind has an economy of shock. Sometimes it spends itself. I felt shame bloom in my cheeks. Shame was a small domestic thing to me, a sauce spill on a Sunday dress. Shame made me step back, clutching my mason jar as if it were a small globe of belonging. A woman in pearls touched my elbow with the sugar-light caution of someone avoiding a spill. Then Lily stepped forward, and the room tilted. She said my name with a syllable of distance that I have never been able to practice. "Mother," she said, and there was a space between us large enough to hold a dozen apologies she had never made. "We don't have room for surprises." The "we" was an entire nation. "It's my granddaughter's shower," she said, gesturing to the tables. "We have a guest list." As if a guest list could erase what you had done for someone 30 years ago. As if a sheet of paper with names printed in gilt could rewrite the hands that had diapered and scolded. Someone took a photograph at that precise second, an image that would be paper for gossip and proof for those who need proof of their own righteousness. A flash, and I remember thinking, this is how villains begin, with a single bright sting of light and the sense that their portrait will be displayed. A man in a gray suit approached, and I saw the badge he wore, security, number 408, matching. The number I would later see in a voicemail that made me feel like an accident. "Ma'am," he said, gentle as a veterinarian, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." There were 100 ways to say it. I have ranked them since. This one was the velvet glove, polite, measured, efficient. I had to laugh, a small, brittle sound, because the absurdity of the afternoon felt theatrical. I had come 600 miles for a bowl of rice and a song. I had brought a mason jar. I had wanted nothing but to put my hands on that belly and whisper an old lullaby. The security guard's hand was on my shoulder then, steadying me as if I were the one who might wander into danger. They led me out into the late sun, and on the porch, a young woman from the catering staff, her apron still dusted with powdered sugar, bent to pick up the pieces of my chipped mug. Her face was kind. She gave me back the broken half as one might give back a relic. I could see for the first time my own reflection in the glass of the front door. An old woman wrapped in thrift store dignity, pearls around her throat, a mason jar in her grasp. The valet took my keys, and in his hand they seemed to be theft instruments. I could have told him, if I had thought, that those keys had unlocked a home for 35 years and not a private room in some upscale play. I could have said, "This is my daughter's house," but I did not. What words can make a person unlearn the taste of absence? Later, in the cramped waiting area beside a ficus that looked better fed than I felt, I remember overhearing a phrase that soured my blood. A woman with a clipboard spoke into her phone in crisp, lawyerly tones. Durable power of attorney dated March 28th, everything transferred to legal counsel pending due diligence. The words landed like hail. I had never signed a durable power of attorney. I had, of course, signed papers in my younger years. Bank authorizations, a promissory note when I co-signed for Lily's little education loan. But nothing that would hand over the keys to the life I had kept. My bungalow, my savings, the mason jar of coins. Could such a thing be moved by a typed document? The idea sat in my gut like a stone of a new weight. I think, as women of a certain age, we sometimes imagine betrayals as melodramatic acts in faraway plays, poisoned goblets, midnight letters. But real betrayal comes as a series of small omissions, then one large omission to crown the rest. First, they were omissions of time, then of affection, then of presence, and now, perhaps, of property. Someone, somewhere, had begun to draft a life that did not include me. I was not alone in the waiting area for long. A woman from the neighborhood, Mrs. Alvarez, who used to bring me tamales at Christmas, approached and kissed my hand. She smelled of masa and forgiveness. "They asked me if you were well," she said, eyes glistening. "I told them you always were." I wanted to tell her everything. About the sealed envelope on the kitchen shelf I'd left behind, about the letter from April, about the appraisal and the receipt with the $230,000 figure. But I did not. I held my mason jar, and I thought of the jar like a bank of memories, now maybe the only true currency I had. As the sun slid toward evening, someone handed me a card with a number scrawled on it. "Call if you need anything," it said. The penmanship was shaky, and the number, 408-555-0199, matched the badge of the security guard who had escorted me out. I tucked that card into the pocket of my coat, near the letter I had folded, and there, beneath it, something thin and white, caught at my finger, a small slip of paper that had been tucked into my coat by mistake. On it, in a hand I recognized like the back of my palm, were 3 words, "Do not open." Beneath that, a time, 6 p.m., April 3rd. I did not know, in that stunned courtyard, that the slip was not for me. I only knew it was the first rope flung into the well. I never expected what I would find in that drawer. Dumas would have said, "Let him who measures the breadth of an offense count not the steps, but the intent, for a small malice may outrun a large one." I had turned the key in that old drawer with the same care a woman uses to prise open a jammed jam jar. It resisted for a moment, and then gave with a small, finalistic sigh. And there, folded like a secret inside an envelope, lay the thing I never expected to find. It was a photocopy at first glance, the header of a law firm I had heard of in passing, Harrison and Clay, then the words, "Durable power of attorney," executed March 28, 2025, transferring all legal and financial authority to my daughter, Lily M. Harrison. My heart stuttered at the sight of the formality. The document bore a notary stamp from Carolyn Reeves, Notary Public, and a signature beneath that looked uncannily like my own. Yet the flow of the letters was wrong, a tremor where my hand usually steadied. My name, Evelyn Marie Thompson, was typed clearly under the signature. Someone had taken my signature, trimmed it, and pasted it into official life. There was a second paper beneath it, a copy of a bank ledger showing dated April 1, 2025, a e-omis wire transfer of $48,000 to an account under Lily's name, and beneath that, a notation, down payment, trust. And under the ledger, a legal receipt for a change of deed recorded at the county recorder's office on April 5, 2025, my bungalow transferred. The figures were there in black ink, $230,000, the assessed value, and a handwritten note in an unfamiliar hand. Expedite for settlement. The letter's corner had been folded back, as if the hand that put it there wanted to come back and smooth the creases. I clutched the papers, and for a moment the room spun with the small domestic tragedies of the past months. Missed calls, the perfume-scented letters, the polite, "we don't have room." What had been a mission had become architecture. Someone had built a house of paperwork to replace the home I kept. My mason jar of coins felt suddenly like a prayer bead. I wanted to run to Lily and shout, to fling the documents at her and demand to know how her hand had come to be heavy enough to write me into nothingness. Instead, I sat. I counted the breaths like a woman counting rosary beads. Anger came slow, luminous, like moonlight on water. That is the thing I have learned about betrayal. At first, it is a fog, then it becomes a mirror, then a map. I had been given a map, and it pointed somewhere I did not want to go. There was a micro cliffhanger in the way my hands closed around the papers. The signature was not mine. I decided in that quiet that the next movement I made would be measured. Dumas wrote of vengeance as an art practiced by those with patience and a sense for timing. Certainly I had patience in abundance, but patience without action is merely waiting with a better conscience. I made a list with the meticulousness of an accountant balancing an old ledger. Find the original documents at the county recorder. Speak to the bank manager. Find out who notarized the March 28th signature. Check the surveillance tapes at my bungalow. And because prudence must sometimes masquerade as modesty, call the only person I knew who still trusted paper more than people. Mr. Royce, my friend at the library, who had lent me books on property law when Lily first left home. Mr. Royce listened to me with the soft attention of someone who has spent a life in the company of stories. "Evelyn," he said finally, folding his hands like a man at prayer, "signatures are peculiar things. They hold history, but the county keeps records. A recorded deed will tell you who filed it and when. If they recorded your property in Lily's name on April 5th, there will be an entry. Bring me the photocopy." We went together that afternoon to the recorder's office, a building that smells faintly of toner and old coffee. The clerk, a young woman named Denise with a nose ring and a halo of hair, was kind in the way people are kind to curious patrons. She pulled the ledger and handed me the digital prints on paper with the casual ceremonial of a church handing a blessing. There, in black type and official ink, was my bungalow's deed recorded as grantor, Evelyn M. Thompson. Grantee, Lily M. Harrison. Instrument number 2025-0419. There was the date, April 5th, 2025. The stamps of the recorder's office looked official enough to make a reasonable person weep. But the deeper thing that made me catch my breath was the notary acknowledgement attached to the document. The notary stamp matched the one on the durable power of attorney, Carolyn Reeves, Notary Public, County of Stanton. I asked Denise if she had a way of telling who had signed in front of the notary. "No," she said, "not beyond what the notary says." She was honest in a way that made me love her. So we wrote Carolyn Reeves' name down and left. Outside, the sun had the kind of brightness that either reveals every detail or hides everything behind glare. I found on my phone the number for Harrison and Clay and forced myself not to call Lily, but instead to call a lawyer I could trust. The lawyer, Annika Patel, was an advocate at a small legal aid clinic downtown who had once helped a neighbor of mine contest a landlord's illegal eviction. She answered in the way lawyers do, practical, direct, already sorting the pieces. "Bring me everything," she said. "We'll subpoena the records. If someone forged a durable power of attorney, that's fraud. We'll get an injunction to freeze transfers." "But Evelyn," "Yes?" I asked. "You need evidence beyond Xerox copies. Originals, signatures, notarization logs. And if there's any surveillance, video from the county recorder or the bank. We'll need to act fast, fast." The words seemed to roll off the tongue with urgency. This was the first time since the party that the air tasted like possibility. I left with a plan, a list, and an appointment for April 10th to file a motion. I felt for the first time since the hand on my shoulder that I was not simply being carried along a tide, but might be learning to row. A micro cliffhanger rose like a breath. We needed the originals. On April 8th, I rode the bus back to my bungalow. The drive had taken me farther than a day. I had to borrow a cab when the last bus skipped Maple Street. The house looked the same from the outside, paint flaking in a familiar place, the tomato plant still drooping in its pot, but there is a peculiar cruelty to things that are unchanged while a life is rearranged. Inside, light moved across the kitchen tiles like a finger tracing an accusation. I checked the locked box under my bed. The lock had not been forced. The velvet pouch that had held my pearls lay where I had left it, and my letters were still tied with the same blue thread. But the original durable power of attorney was gone. In its place, someone had left a white envelope with my name typed on it, and, in a hand I recognized as Lily's, the words, "For Mother, do not open." The cursive had been steady, practiced, an attempt at affection. I sat on the bed and wept, not loudly, but as a house leaks water, steadily. The papers in my hands were copies. The originals had vanished. Whoever had taken them had taken the hinge of my life, the proof. The mason jar, as always, felt like a relic to be handled with care. I put the pearls back in the velvet pouch with a tenderness I had only reserved for birth announcements and hospice visits. There is a peculiarity to saving things. We save them hoping to burn them later as fuel for a different life. I called Annika and told her the originals were gone. "That's worse," she said, "but not fatal. We subpoena the bank for wire records and the recorder for originals. We get a forensic document examiner to compare signatures. And we subpoena Ms. Reeves's notary journal. If she is a registered notary, she must have an entry for March 28th. If there's no entry, that's perjury." Perjury. The word rang like metal. It promised consequences that tasted of law books and prison, of cold rooms where guilt is measured in paperwork. I thought of Lily, her voice that cold afternoon, and wondered how a daughter becomes someone who would sign her mother out of existence with pens and stamps. If Dumas had written it, he would have said, "A family war begins not with gunfire but with ledger lines." One must read the margins. I paid to have an independent forensic examiner come to my bungalow on April 9th. The examiner, Mr. Hargreaves, who smelled of old ink and cigarette smoke, examined the photocopy and compared it to my signatures on old bank checks and the deed from 1999. "They've done a reasonable job," he said finally, tapping the magnifier like a judge striking a desk. "But the pressure points are wrong. The downstroke at the E is too light. Whoever did this traced, perhaps, but they did not know the weight of your hand. A trace signature will often lack the ironed rhythm of a lifelong signer." "You can tell?" I asked. "I can tell," he said, "but we need the original. A copy can be traced from an original, so proving forgery on a copy is harder. If we get the original durable power of attorney, I can show the ink, the indentations. Also, the notary journal." We were closing in, like hunters following an animal's footprints. I felt both predatory and frightened. I had the mason jar, but now I had a plan. A micro cliffhanger surfaced. The notary journal might not exist. On April 10th, we went to the bank where my account had been shifted. The bank manager, a man named Thomas with an unfortunate resemblance to a steamroller, examined my ID and my old passbook with a skeptical expression. "We did receive instructions on the account to transfer authority to Ms. Harrison," he explained, tapping a keyboard. The durable power of attorney was presented on March 29th. We also received a withdrawal request for $48,000 on April 1st, which was wired to an external account. He looked apologetic in the manner of city clerks who are accustomed to inconveniencing the elderly with apologies. "Do you have the original on file?" Annika asked. "We retain copies for our records," he said. "We do not keep originals unless necessary, but we can produce the presentation copy and the transaction logs." He hesitated, then added, "There was a call placed to our wire desk from a number associated with Harrison and Clay on March 30th, authorizing the transfer." I felt the air thinning. A call from the law firm, the firm Lily used. The circle was tightening. Annika filed motions that afternoon to freeze accounts and to compel production of records. She also sent a subpoena to the county recorder and one to Harrison and Clay requesting their notary logs for March 28th. I sat in the courthouse hallway and watched people bustle like ants, each carrying a problem. A woman with a stroller smiled at me in the elevator and said, "Good luck," as if she knew the fight was a noble thing. The week that followed was a study in small cruelties and larger humiliations. Friends asked me whether I wanted help. Lily's fiancé, Daniel, sent a text asking, in a phrase that made my teeth ache, for space to manage family affairs. There were whispers from people who had seen the photograph from the shower. My name, once a familiar shape on neighborly lips, seemed to be something people now measured cautiously before uttering. But then, on April 15th, a breakthrough. Denise at the recorder's office called Annika in a voice that held a tremor. "We have the logbook," she said. "And I noticed the notary journal entry for Carolyn Reeves on March 28th has been circled, and the signature looks different than her usual entry. There's also a clerk annotation, questionable signature, with initials. We didn't mean to flag it so publicly." Denise's candor smelled like rain. Annika took the notation and smiled in a way I felt in my bones, as the grin of someone who had found a seam in the fabric. "We'll subpoena that clerk to testify," she said. "If the recorder has a doubt, that will be powerful to a judge." I remember sitting in the hallway of the courthouse with the mason jar at my feet, listening to the city sound like an ocean, and thinking how small objects anchor us to truth. The jar had become less about money and more about testimony. Coins are witnesses because they resist being erased. A micro cliffhanger. The recorder had a clerk's annotation. The next week was the kind of frenetic tapestry that makes a woman from my generation revert to the steadying rituals of tea and list-making. We had a hearing on April 20th to request an emergency freeze on the transfers. Annika called witnesses, Denise from the recorder's office, Mr. Hargreaves, the forensic examiner, and, most importantly, Ms. Carolyn Reeves, the notary. To our astonishment, Ms. Reeves's attorney called and asked if she might appear by video instead of in person. "She has a health condition," he said. The judge, Judge Albright, whose robes speak of many held breaths, listened and then thumped his gavel like a measured heartbeat. He granted a temporary restraining order barring further transfers pending discovery. It felt like a small victory, a bandage placed on a wound. We were not yet at battle. We had carved out a safe field for ourselves. Then, in the judge's chambers, as Annika and I gathered our papers, a clerk, eyes wide, pulled Annika aside. He had a file that he could not produce in court yet. It was too fresh. "There's surveillance footage from April 2nd, he whispered. "From the private courier service that delivered documents to your bungalow. They recorded a pickup and a drop-off that day, time-stamped 3:20 p.m. and 3:42 p.m. The driver's log shows the delivery was to an attorney's office in downtown Stanton, Harrison and Clay again. The company's name had a ring to it now, like a bell tolling a familiar hour. Annika's face, always control and focus, shifted like someone learning new chords. "We'll subpoena the courier logs," she said. "If there's a paper trail, we have a path." I felt like a carpenter finding a lost screw and holding it up to the light. A micro cliffhanger. Courier logs existed. On April 23rd, as rain lashed the windows and the mason jar clinked like a small cathedral when I set it on the kitchen table, Mr. Royce handed me a small brown envelope with trembling hands. "Someone left this at the library," he said. "It was tucked into the pages of a book on wills." I slid the flap open, and inside was a USB drive and a sticky note. Play at your own peril. My first instinct was caution. My second was curiosity heavy as a kettle on the stove. I took the drive to Annika. We connected it in a secure room lined with books and pale light. On it were audio files, recorded phone calls. At first, I could not believe my ears. There was Lily's laugh. And behind it, a voice I did not recognize, which I would later learn belonged to a paralegal at Harrison and Clay, telling her, "We have prepared the durable power of attorney paperwork as discussed. Mother's signature has been scanned and appears to be a good match. We'll present it to the bank on March 29th. The deed transfer will record April 5th. Once the assets are consolidated into the family trust, the settlement will proceed." Lily's voice, my daughter's voice, came back, calm and distant. "Good. Make sure the notary is confirmed." The recording made my chest ache. It was, in a single file, the threshing of all the lies. It showed intention, orchestration. It showed that the thing that had been done was not an accident of bureaucracy, but a plan. For a moment I thought of the mason jar bright in my lap, and I felt like a child whose toy had been taken and put under glass. Dumas would have observed here. When a man's instrument is a pen, one must learn where the ink is kept. We had what Annika called probative evidence: the courier logs, the bank wire records, Denise's clerk notation, Mr. Hargreaves's forensic analysis, and now an audio that suggested coordination. An injunction was expanded. The bank accounts were frozen. The deed transfer was provisionally suspended. The city felt giddy with the possibility of truth. Lily, according to messages Annika managed to obtain, was told in no uncertain terms that legal discovery was underway. Here was the turning point. I could continue to be the grandmother who collected dust and teacups, or I could become a woman who would, with care and precision, reclaim the architecture of her life. I had the choice, and I chose. A micro cliffhanger. I chose to fight. That choice demanded more than lawyers. It demanded strategy. Annika suggested we go public to file a civil complaint, but I hesitated. Publicity would humiliate Lily, certainly. It might also humiliate me. How does a mother sue her own child? The world delights in tragedies that are spectacle. We have to be careful of feeding the appetite that devours people for entertainment. Yet the law felt like a tool to be used, and I had learned to use my hands. We convened a small room of allies, Mr. Royce, who would serve as an attesting witness to my long-standing residency, Denise, who would testify to the notation in the recorder's office, Mr. Hargreaves, who would explain the handwriting analysis, and Denise's manager, who had pulled the courier logs. Each person was a stitch in a net I was slowly weaving around the truth. On April 28th, 2 weeks after the emergency freeze, Annika delivered a pile of documents to me. "We have one more thing to do," she said. "We need to confront Harrison and Clay with everything. We'll deliver a demand to produce originals, and we may take a deposition. You must be ready." I had been audio recorded once against my will. That file had shown intention. I would now make an intention of my own, to show the world that names sewn into paper can be unwoven. There was a softer, Dumas-like moral aside here in my heart. The measure of justice is not that it is swift, but that it is tempered with the conscience. We do not seek revenge for the delight of seeing one fall. We seek rectitude so that the scales may once again balance. The day we went to Harrison and Clay to deliver the demand, the clouds hung like warnings. The firm's facade was all polished stone and men in tailored coats. I felt the mason jar in my coat pocket like a small altar. We were ushered into a conference room with a view of the city and a pitcher of filtered water. The firm's senior partner, Mr. Clay, with hair as white as the pages he signed, met us with the kind of bland courtesy that reads as armor. "I'm sorry for your trouble," he said, and then, with astonishing candor, "but we are bound by client confidentiality." Annika set the file on the table and let the evidence speak. "We have courier logs," she said. "We have the bank wire. We have the recorder's notation. We have an audio file indicating coordination. And we have reason to believe the notary journal entry is questionable." Mr. Clay folded his hands. "We represent our clients zealously," he began. His voice had the smoothness of a man who had weathered storms. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, you may proceed through the courts. But until then, we must protect our client's interests. He did not offer a denial. He did not, at least outwardly, apologize. Instead, he produced one small thing that made my stomach drop: a sealed envelope stamped with my name in a firm hand. This was dropped at our office last week with instructions that Ms. Harrison was to be notified if certain documents surfaced, he said. We thought it best to hand it to you directly. I opened the envelope with hands that had steadied in the crucible of legal list-making. Inside was a single photograph, one I had not seen before. It was taken on March 27th, outside my bungalow, blurred at the edges, but unmistakable, a courier placing a parcel on my stoop. In the background, a car with a fleet logo that matched the courier company's. Someone had taken that photograph and given it to the lawyers. Beneath it was a line: "For proof, if necessary." My stomach turned to lead. The world seemed to tilt. The courier had come. My papers had been taken in a blur of efficiency. Someone had photographed it to ensure there would be no doubt. And there, in the photograph, was a figure at the door, small, hunched, and behind them a dark shape that could have been anyone. The photograph was at once proof and ambiguity. A final micro cliffhanger arrived like a bell. The photograph suggested a third hand. The room grew quiet. Mr. Clay leaned forward with a bland, gentlemanly compassion that made me grit my teeth. "If there has been a misunderstanding," he said, "we are willing to cooperate in discovery. We will produce our notary logs and records. But understand, Miss Thompson, that legal processes are slow. Litigation is an odious thing for families." Perhaps that was the only thing he said that was true. Litigation is odious. It eats at the fabric of people. But it also lays bare what is hidden. The turning point had come. I had the seeds of proof. I had a legal path. Yet I also had the knowledge that public exposure would tear at a fabric, my family's, that could never be restored whole. For a few moments I felt like I stood on a precipice looking at a valley where both justice and ruin lay tangled. Dumas would have noted here, "A righteous heart must judge itself before judging others." And yet, when I left Harrison and Clay that day, the mason jar in my pocket felt heavy with possibility. I was no longer a passive object in my daughter's narrative. I had summoned allies, set the law to work, and found, in the most unlikely of places, the machinery of proof. That very night, back at my bungalow, as the rain intensified and the radio hummed old songs, my telephone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. I answered, and a voice I recognized as Lily's, soft, deliberate, said, "Mother, we can make this easier." There was a pause, and then, "Meet me at the old pier at 11:15 p.m. tonight. Come alone." The line went dead. I sat with the receiver in my hand and the mason jar before me. The pearls were on the dresser, sleeping. The clock ticked toward 11, and with it toward a decision. I thought of every lullaby I had ever sung, every scraped knee kissed, every small sacrifice tucked into a mason jar. I thought of dignity and how finely it can be threaded to the heart. The choice lay before me, to meet at the pier and let the confrontation unfold in a place where shadows could swallow words, or to bring counsel and force the truth into the light of courtrooms where paper is the arbiter. Before taking my coat, I touched the pearls and whispered, "If this is a trap, may the truth be its undoing." A micro cliffhanger closed the night. She had asked to meet alone. I did not sleep. I filled my thermos with tea and slid the mason jar into the glove compartment of my small car, like a relic tucked into the altar of a faithful companion. The night had a taste of metal. The pier's boards creaked like an old throat. I walked to the edge where the water lapped and waited. At 11:05, a figure approached. It was Lily. She wore a coat that cinched like armor and carried in her hand a small envelope. Her eyes were tired, yes, but there was something else. Regret? Resolve? I could not tell. We stood in that thin space between water and sky, two shapes cut in the same moonlight. "Mother," she said, and for a second I thought I might still be able to coax her into being the child who once stole the last cookie and hid it in her pocket. I thought, maybe we could talk. "Why did you call security?" I asked. Lily's mouth thinned. "That day," she said, "you surprised us. People here have a life, arrangements." I panicked. You signed papers, I said. My signature is on a document dated March 28th. The deed was recorded April 5th. There was a wire on April 1st. She inhaled like someone who had been holding a breath for too long. Mother, I didn't. Her voice cracked on the didn't, and for an instant I saw my daughter, small and scrappy, telling me the truth. Then she steadied. There were conversations. I thought it was the only way. Only way for what? I asked. To protect the baby, she said. To protect our future. We were scared about your health, about the house. People have said you might not be able to manage. We thought to take, I finished. We thought to make you invisible. Her eyes flared. It wasn't like that. We were pressured by Daniel's family, by creditors, by people who said that if we didn't move assets into a trust, something worse could happen. The durable power of attorney was supposed to let us manage things for you so there wouldn't be chaos. You had other ways, I said. You could have asked. You could have said no to those who counseled haste. She reached into her coat and took out the small envelope. Her hands trembled. Inside were two things: a check for $5,000 made out to Evelyn M. Thompson and a letter. The letter was thin and precise. Her voice softened as she read. Mother, I thought it best to secure the assets for the baby's future. I'm sorry for the hurt. Please forgive me. Forgiveness. The word hung like a lantern. Before I could answer, a car light swept across the pier, and in that bright arc, I saw the face of a man I recognized, Mr. Clay, standing in the distance, phone in hand, watching. My first instinct was that he had followed her. My second was that I had been set into a theater of observation. Lily looked up, and in that split second I saw shame and anger assemble into something like armor. She said, Mother, please, don't make this uglier. Make it uglier? I echoed. You are the one who invited ugliness. She took a step back. You don't understand, she whispered. There are people who will hurt you. Do you think I am brittle? I asked. Do you think a woman with a mason jar of coins cannot stand? Her face crumpled like fine paper. She started to speak then, but from the darkness came the click of a camera. Someone had taken our photograph under the pier. The flash snapped like a verdict. In the wavering light of that shutter, Lily's face turned to fear. There was a final micro cliffhanger. Someone had photographed us. A moral aside pressed itself to my tongue. Dumas's. Stern counsel. Beware the man who advises haste in family matters. He is often prepared to collect the spoils. The light in the distance grew brighter as another figure approached from the shadows, and I realized with a cold certainty that the public theater I had feared was not merely possible. It had already begun. My choice to fight had been made, but the way forward was now entangled with exposure, with the photograph that would move like a key through many doors. I gripped the envelope in my hand and felt the mason jar in my coat. The tide slapped the pier's posts. Lily's eyes were wet and quick like a child's in a church. Behind me, the city hummed like a beast with many hearts. There is a moment, I have learned, when time stands between two beats, before action and after action. I had stepped over that line. The map of my life was no longer something someone could fold and put away. And then a voice, low and terrible in its familiarity, said my name. Mother, said the voice from behind me. Lily's, but not only Lily's. In the shape of it was also the voice I had feared. Daniel's counsel, the paralegal, the firm. You are making this very difficult. I turned slowly, as if unrolling a script that had been written without my consent. In the light stood a man I had only seen in photographs at the shower. Daniel, dark and even, the kind of man who trims hedges in his image. His hand rested on the shoulder of another, an unfamiliar woman with a camera, and in her hand, the camera flashed one more time. The final cliffhanger of this night landed like a bell. Daniel had not come to negotiate. He had come to witness. They say the sea has a memory. It remembers the boats, the lanterns, the scraps of conversation that fall off piers like forgotten scarves. That night, the pier remembered everything. My footsteps, Lily's breath, the click of a camera, and when Daniel's shadow fell over us. The memory tightened like a noose. The camera's flash had the arrogance of a judge's gavel. In that burst of light, I saw Daniel's jaw set in the way of men who believe power is a thing to be shown rather than earned. Mr. Clay at the shoreline with his phone aimed like a scribe, and Lily, my daughter, pale and small under the coat she wore like armor. The cold wind smelled of salt, and my chamomile tea in the thermos tasted suddenly tinny. I clutched the envelope in my hand until the paper hurt. "Mother," Lily whispered, and for a moment every lullaby I'd sung returned to me like a chorus. Please what?" I asked. "Please undo the months of careful erasure?" She did not answer. Behind her, Daniel stepped forward and said, in a voice that brooked no contradiction, "We can arrange private settlement, avoid public action. You'll sign papers to keep matters discreet. No litigation, no scandal." I felt the word settlement like a slug. It is a tidy word, meant to sew shut openings. Daniel's offer smelled of the same antiseptic that had laced the chandeliered hallways of the shower party. He imagined that money and discretion could stitch a wound that had been torn by intent. "You want me to sign away my right to know?" I asked. "You would have me sign and pretend I did not hear them speak of forged papers and courier logs?" His mouth tightened. "It is better for the family." "Which family?" I asked. "The family that leaves me at a doorstep? The family that photographs a mother under a pier." My voice rose with a steadiness I did not altogether feel. The tide slapped the boards and a gull cried like a small bell. "You said we at the shower. Who is the we that thought this plan wise?" Lily's hands trembled. For all her adult composure, she was my child in gesture and fear. "People said it would be simpler this way," she said. "They said there were creditors and threats, and that if assets were not consolidated." Her sentence dwindled into the water. "Who is they?" I demanded. The question felt like an incantation. "Names have a habit of binding deeds." Before anyone could answer, headlights swept across the pier. A car drew up and the door opened. Out stepped Mr. Royce with his cardigan flapping, Denise with a folder clutched like a shield, and impossibly Annika. She had left her briefcase. In the car, and her face was lit with the bright determination of a woman who had been up all night drafting motions and tempering her resolve. "You called us," she said, as if the mere statement explained everything. In fact, she had not been warned. She had arrived because, in a quiet move of legal chess, she had suspected that a confrontation beneath the moonlight would not go well for the truth without witnesses. She had asked the courthouse to send a deputy to stand by for safety. The deputy was in the car behind them, radio buzzing. A micro cliffhanger. Help had arrived unexpectedly. Daniel's smile was all tight steel. "This is theatrics," he said. "We were trying to reach an understanding." "An understanding?" Mr. Royce asked, voice like a library bell. "Is that what one calls forged signatures and stolen deeds?" Denise stepped forward and produced a sheaf of papers. The notary journal entry showing Carolyn Reeves' March 28th notation, circled with the clerk's annotation. The courier log showing the March 27th pickup and the chain of custody. The bank's wire transfer confirmation for April 1st, and a copy of the March 29th presentation form from Harrison and Clay. The folder seemed to glow with the weight of order. Annika placed her hand on Lily's arm, not in a rebuke, but like one might steady a fevered child. "Evelyn," she said, "we can do the quiet way if you prefer, but you must know that settlement often buries things forever. You would sign away your right to challenge what has already been done. What kind of peace would you have if it is purchased with silence?" I thought of the mason jar in the glove compartment of my car, the jar of coins that had traveled with me like an amulet. What could a few $1,000s buy against the architecture of a stolen life? The $48,000 wired on April 1st was not merely money. It was a stitch in a larger seam intended to hide intention. I refused. I had never been one to trade truth for convenience. Then something happened that I had not expected. Lily's face crumpled and she started to speak. And the words that came were not the smooth, practiced lines I had heard on the audio file. They were raw. "I thought I was protecting us," she said. "I thought if I moved things into a trust, it would shield us from mess. Daniel said the creditors would come for the house. He said better us than strangers. I was afraid." Her voice broke against the salt air. "I didn't know they would forge the signature. I didn't know Mr. Clay's office would—" She stopped. Daniel moved as if to intercede, but Denise held out a hand. "There's more," she said. "It was Mr. Royce who produced the final piece. a courier receipt with a notation in his handwriting. He had found it tucked into a returned book at the library, slipped between pages like a bookmark of truth. The receipt was a return manifest from the private courier, stamped March 29th, and signed by a hand that matched in the forensic analyst's report, a paralegal at Harrison and Clay, one Matthew Haynes. The name was a small key. Annika's eyes narrowed. "We'll subpoena Mr. Haynes," she said. "We'll compel him to testify. If he signs a sworn affidavit acknowledging the transfer and describing the chain of events, and if he admits to forging or facilitating the forging of a notary stamp, that will be sufficient to accuse Harrison and Clay of professional misconduct and fraud." I felt the world tilt toward order. The legal machine, slow as it is, had teeth, a micro cliffhanger. A paralegal's name had surfaced. Daniel's face went white as paper. "No," he said. "Haynes would never—" "People are fallible," Denise replied. "And desperate people take desperate steps. We have the audio, the logs, and a signature analysis. We have probable cause." It was the deputy, radio in hand, who then announced that he had received a call from a courier dispatcher who wished to come forward. The dispatcher arrived, soaked by the rain, with a folder and the tired look of someone who has seen too many packages and too many lies. He produced a statement. Matthew Haynes had been recorded arguing with an unknown man at Harrison and Clay on March 28th about the signature. He had been nervous about the notary's stamp and had asked for assurance that the presentation would proceed. The dispatcher's voice trembled as he spoke, but his facts were clean. Haynes's nervousness was the fixings of a trap. He had been perhaps persuaded or paid to act. He had been promised discretion and had been given a photograph to reassure him, an image of my bungalow stoop with a parcel labeled for Mr. Clay's office. He was, in the eyes of the court, the pivot. The next days were a blur of depositions and motions. On May 3rd at 9:30 a.m., Matthew Haynes was deposed in a small conference room that smelled of coffee and legal pads. His voice when it came was small and brittle. Under oath, he admitted to preparing paperwork on March 27th, to handling a scanned signature, and to authorizing a courier pickup to retrieve documents from my bungalow. He insisted, in a voice that quavered, that he had been following instructions from a senior associate at the firm and from Daniel's counsel. The chain of accountability, he said, had been obfuscated behind a fog of urgency and client interest. Haynes's testimony was a match to gasoline. It set aflame pretense. He testified that he had been asked to ensure swift action because of creditors pressing for immediate consolidation. He admitted to scanning and reproducing my signature on a durable power of attorney and, in a moment that sounded like a confession, said, "I should have questioned it more." I was told to expedite. The gallery of the courtroom leaned forward. Lily sat with her hands clasped like a penitent. Daniel's jaw had gone soft like wax. Mr. Clay, who had watched over his staff like a sphinx, now looked like a man who had been misinformed by the very edicts he entrusted to others. A micro cliffhanger. The paralegal confessed under oath. In the following hearings, the forensic report by Mr. Hargreaves was read aloud. The pressure points in the signature did not match mine. The ink was not consistent with a pen used as of March 28th at my bungalow, and the notary journal was altered. The recorder's clerk, Denise, testified that the notation "questionable signature" had been placed with her initials and had been meant to flag a discrepancy. The bank's wire desk produced a record of a March 30th call from Harrison and Clay, instructing the transfer. The courier dispatcher confirmed the pickup times, and a private investigator, hired by Annika, located CCTV footage of a van with the courier company logo, stopping outside my bungalow at 3:20 p.m. on March 27th. The courtroom felt like a cathedral of facts, and the facts were heavy, precise, and unforgiving. By June 1st, the county had launched an investigation into Harrison and Clay for professional misconduct and potential criminal referral. The state bar sent a notice of inquiry. The bank unfroze the accounts pending the outcome, but agreed to reverse the April 1st wire as provisional restitution. The restraining order that Annika had, first obtained on April 20th, was replaced by a preliminary injunction that restored my authority over my accounts and prevented any sale, transfer, or encumbrance of my bungalow. Instrument number 2025-0419, the deed recorded April 5th, was placed on hold by the county recorder pending the outcome of the investigation. It was the law's peculiar slow mercy. It places a hand on the wheel and says, "Not yet." What then of Lily? Her role was complex. She had, in that recorded conversation, indicated complicity in the plan. She had called and coordinated. But her testimony in court, raw, tear-stained human, revealed that she had been under the influence of fear and counsel, both personal and legal, that pressed upon her like a fog. She had been frightened for her child's future. She had made decisions that were wrong. She confessed her errors publicly, something the press loved and the bar could not easily dismiss. The press, which loves both villains and repentance, framed her as a woman torn between love of family and the pressure to secure a lifestyle. Editorials judged, friends condemned. Daniel's family slid into a silence that was louder than any accusation. Harrison and Clay's senior partner, Mr. Clay, resigned from the partnership on June 10th, citing a failure of oversight, which is the kind of phrase partners use when they wish to avoid the more corrosive truth. The paralegal, Matthew Haynes, faced charges for forgery and was suspended pending criminal proceedings. The notary, if such a person had been impersonated, was subject to investigation. There is a peculiar thing about consequences. They can be as public as the misdeed. Daniel's attempt to negotiate a private settlement evaporated under the harsh light of court. He found himself disowned by the circles that had once admired his poise. Invitations stopped coming. People who once smiled at his hedge trimming now passed him like a tree that had been struck. Lily lost for a time the social oxygen she had taken for granted. She lost also something less visible, trust, a micro cliffhanger. Consequences had a public echo. And what of me? In the end, the deed to my bungalow was declared void as recorded, pending the criminal investigation. The county recorder's office sent written notice on June 15th that instrument number 2025-0419 would be administratively rescinded. The $48,000 wire was reversed on June 18th and returned to my account. The bank issued a letter confirming the reversal and expressing regret for any distress caused. County prosecutor later filed charges against Matthew Haynes for forgery and against unnamed conspirators for fraud. Harrison and Clay faced professional sanctions and a slate of civil suits. The state bar issued a public reprimand to the senior associate who had supervised Haynes, and Mr. Clay's name was, for a while, linked to poor oversight in the newspapers. The court heard arguments on July 2nd. In a moment that felt like the final chord of a long, wrenching symphony, Judge Albright pronounced a decision that felt to me like sunlight after a storm. He found in favor of my motion to void the deed transfer for lack of valid notarization and for fraud in the procurement of the durable power of attorney. He ordered the transfer instrument set aside and required Harrison and Clay to produce the original documents for review. He also noted in his ruling that the evidence supported a referral to the county prosecutor for possible criminal prosecution. When the clerk announced the ruling, I felt an odd lightness. It was not joy in a theatrical sense. It was the relief of a woman who had been clasping a hot coal and could finally put it down. I went home, and before I let myself cry or laugh, I opened the mason jar. The coins rattled like a small choir. I counted them out slowly, as if pronouncing the names of saints. There was not much, just enough to buy a small trip or a new pair of shoes, or to tip a cab driver who had been patient with an old woman who had traveled for justice. But the true restitution was not the $48,000. It was the restoration of my name in the public ledger, the unpicking of the lie, and the knowledge that the architecture of my life had been acknowledged as mine again. The mason jar was not merely money. It was the symbol of a dignity that could not be signed away. A Dumas-like thought hovered then in my mind, that justice, while blind in legend, can be made to see if one holds up enough small lights. The law is a long ladder. We may climb it rung by rung, but we reach the top by being resolute. I saw Lily one quiet morning after the ruling. We met at the little cafe where she'd once fed me pastries when she was a student with little money and many dreams. She looked smaller, as if the public stripping had shaved away some unnecessary grandeur. I could have rejoiced at her contrition. Instead, I felt a compassion I had not expected. She bowed her head and took my hand. "I am sorry," she said simply. "I have been living in fear of what the world will do to my baby. I was ashamed to tell you." "And you thought secrecy would make love stronger?" I asked. "I thought it would protect us," she said. "I was wrong." "You were afraid," I said. "Fear makes people do things they would never dream of otherwise. But it does not excuse them." We talked for a long time about what had been done and what could be built again. She asked for restitution in a way that mattered less for the money than for the act. She offered, in court, to assist in making amends, to testify honestly, and to cooperate if prosecutions followed. She did not ask me to forget. She did not ask me to swallow. She asked only that we begin to stitch a new pattern together, one with honest stitches. I forgave her, not as an act of theatrical magnanimity, but because forgiveness is a form of insistence. It insists that we continue to speak truth. She too had to live under the consequences of her choices. She apologized, and later, after the criminal proceedings began, she publicly acknowledged her complicity and the pressure she had been under. It cost her friends. It cost her status. But it was the only honest route. The moral of it all is a simple one. Though put in the language of Dumas, it tastes like iron. Betrayal is a work of intent, but it is undone by the patient architecture of truth. A false signature will not last if the people who keep records keep faith with memory. A forged document can be exposed by 1,000 small witnesses. Courier logs, notary journals, a dispatcher's cry. There is also another truth that I learned. People such as Daniel and those who advised haste often parlay urgency into consent. Act now, they say, as if haste were virtue, but haste is a lover of falsehood. Slow work, records, depositions, the careful stacking of evidence is the enemy of fraud. I used the $48,000 returned to me not to buy needless luxury, but to secure the bungalow's future. I paid for repairs to the roof and replaced the drooping tomato plant in its pot with a small herb garden that smells of rosemary and thyme. I put $20,000 in a certificate of deposit with my name as sole owner and gave Lily a small written plan for how we might manage things together, transparently if she wished. We both agreed that the durable power of attorney, when it might be necessary for future elder care, would be constructed with clear legal oversight, witnesses, and a third-party guardian ad litem to ensure no coercion. I returned the pearls to my neck one Sunday and wore them with the kind of pride that does not need to glitter. They felt like a crown I had earned by endurance rather than by title. The mason jar sits on the kitchen shelf, still a jar of coins, but now also a reliquary of the battle we fought and the dignity we reclaimed. There were legal repercussions beyond the civil remedies. The county prosecutor pursued the case. Charges were filed against Matthew Haynes. Harrison and Clay faced sanctions and civil exposure. Mr. Clay resigned, and the state bar issued reprimands. The criminal cases, of course, moved slower than the court of public opinion, but the direction of justice was clear and visible. It was not a parade. It was a series of small, lawful actions that aggregated into consequence. As for Lily and me, we repaired the strands that could be mended. She visited more often. She sat with me on the porch and listened to me recite the old stories I had collected like shells. She learned with a painful humility how to ask instead of assume. We made a new habit of sharing our plans over tea, and we taught the child she bore, my granddaughter, some of the ways of our family, such as kindness, the correctness of an apology, and the care for things small and true. Before I close this tale, let me say what Dumas might have said in a softer voice. A wound inflicted by greed is deep, but a wound tended by truth will heal into a scar that tells the story of survival rather than an absence. We must measure our victories not by how loudly we strike, but by how faithfully we stitch the torn fabric afterward. If my story touched you, take a moment to share it with someone who needs courage today. If it made you think, leave a comment. Tell us about a time you stood up for yourself. And if you'd like to hear more, old confessions, small victories, and the quiet lessons of a life lived, please subscribe. This old heart has more truths yet to tell, and your listening is the kindling that keeps them warm. A micro cliffhanger. Tell someone. The smallest share keeps truth alive.